And there are a lot of good thinkers around about this. People with some real corporate memory. For instance, I don't know whether any of you have heard of a particular management guru called Peter Drucker. He died, I think, about 4 years ago now. He was a big American management guru. I think quite a wise old soul. And he said around about the late 90s that we were living through a time of revolution in which our mental geography was altering. It had happened in the Industrial Revolution, when people could leave their villages for the first time, could see the sea. If you lived in the middle of England, you never saw the sea. You didn't leave your village. You know, the Industrial Revolution, sort of strictly speaking, started with the arrival of the steam engine, but in fact, he suggested it started for people with the arrival of the railroad, which suddenly they had a different perspective, a different set of possibilities. He thought that for us too, that through internet communication and internet commerce, that we also were experiencing one of those epic times when our mental geography was shifted, and that we were only in the early days, didn't quite know where it would end up. And he said, you know, I won't be here when it does. And I think he was implying that we did have to forgive ourselves a little bit, because we are hanging on by the skin of our teeth in many ways. We didn't ask for the turbulence we're living through, but we're in it. And you know, I'd still prefer to be living in our times with all its raciness and so on than in my parents' time, having lived through one war and facing another. I still would prefer, even though in many ways they were much more stable times in terms of the values and the codes and the authority structures. That's what they faced. 2 world wars. So how can we learn to enter that group that's starting to make our times work for them? Well, sometimes it's quite counterintuitive. If you take the work of a big, very prominent US psychological researcher with this unpronounceable Polish name, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, his book is called Living Well. It's another little book. I'm trying not to recommend gigantic tomes for you. It's a bit of a modern classic, and he did all this research, very rigorous research at the University of Chicago, and he and his team found that people who stretched themselves outside their comfort zone, didn't tilt at massive windmills, but just definitely stretched themselves outside their comfort zone, lived better on a range of measurements, both self-reported and observed by others. That although a lot of their subjects, and I certainly, yearn for tranquility, you know, stop the world, I want to get off, why can't it be tranquil again? That it's not necessarily the best accompaniment to serenity, not at all. And this wellness, this new emerging study area called wellness, very much emphasises this. I think a lot of us don't want to hear it, but that's what they found. And I don't think, in a way, there's been enough curiosity around people who thrive. There's been all this emphasis for years now on dysfunction, on the people who didn't thrive. But actually, what are the patterns of good behaviour leading to wellness in people? What do we know about that? Well, we are starting to, as I said, learn. We're starting to learn and name some of these things. Martin Seligman, the researcher's researcher, who's written a lot of work, most notably Learned Optimism, he's throwing more and more effort into exploring resilience and young people's thriving. And the results of our research show, he wrote, that those who report the greatest life satisfaction or happiness are those who enjoy a sense of meaning and purpose in their lives, a sense of hopefulness, optimism, that they can make a difference and have an inclination to contribute because they believe their actions will have impact. I want to be taken seriously. The corollary, those who are at the greatest risk of depression suffer a sense of hopelessness and helplessness. Numerous studies shows that such sentiment can be overcome through early intervention, which includes reflection and action. Another man rather in demand these days is a psychologist called Andrew O'Keefe, and he consults to big business quite a lot. He's watched the process of change. He's written a book called The Boss. He's had great success with it. And he thinks we need to recognise one thing about ourselves. People are fine with change, he says, provided it meets one criterion, that it does not involve loss. We're hardwired for loss aversion, more ironically than the opportunity to gain. We fight frantically if we are threatened or at risk of loss. When change is presented to people, if we detect gain, we support it. If we detect loss, we resist. If we're uncertain, we err on the side of resistance, as we cannot yet classify the implications. I think that's just so thought-provoking. Here's another gem from him. Humans are hardwired to deny reality, to emphasise what is possible, and to underestimate what is practical. This is the instinct that causes business leaders to plan optimistically and disregard implementation. It means that leaders underestimate the required effort, resources and time, and the capability of people to manage the change. And Andrew Robb, who's the current minister, shadow minister for finance, who was a very fine political operator, he used to run the Liberal Party, and he said to me once, anybody who comes to a community advocating massive change has to declare their own self-interest. Otherwise, they'll get absolutely nowhere. So his point was, you sit down and you say, look, my job depends on this, quite frankly. I have undertaken that I can introduce some new policies, and this is one of the ones I'm suggesting to you, so there's a lot in it for me. Now, can we talk? As opposed to all of the rubbish, oh, well, of course, there's nothing in it for me, it's all for you. People just simply don't believe it. So I thought there's a very good political insight about how to handle change. Now that's the personal, and I can go on and on, but I won't. But in my final 5 minutes, I'd like to skate over what might be required of the broader community too, because obviously that's been very much a theme of your Gosford Talks, because I do think individuals can manage some of this, but I think it's a nonsense. I believe this very deeply. And I really disagree with a lot of the American sort of tone that comes out, sort of saying, if the individual can change, everything will be fine. Well, look, in your dreams is what I'd say. You can do the changing, but a well-governed community with some good supportive values will augment you and your change much more than you trying to do it on your own.